So the question, has inflation impacted living standards in recent years, is important to consider because it would provide consumers with knowledge in significant changes in pricing and how that impacts the economy, especially in recent years. And then this is an economics question because inflation would impact spending, which would affect living standards, and that's a really important part of the economy is spending. So inflation is a symptom of many economic phases that a country goes through, and within an inflationary period, the costs of goods and services rises and the purchasing power of the dollar decreases. The inflation rate is oftentimes calculated by a consumer price index, which averages the cost of a basket of goods and services from around the country. Therefore, cost of living, which is a number that represents standard of living and includes housing, food, transportation, taxes, and healthcare, is determined by rising prices and the value of consumers' dollars falling. According to Investopedia, which is a website that I used for my research, this means that living standards go down as consumers' wages would decrease, as shown in the green and red graph. There would be higher prices in real estate, interest rates would increase, which would negatively affect people's investments, and if the inflationary period continues for an unprecedented amount of time, the country heads into the direction of a recession. We've also discussed in class there's a theory of relationship between inflation rate and unemployment demonstrated by the Phillips curve, in which unemployment goes up as inflation rate goes down. This shows an indirect relationship between inflation and living standards. However, through my research, I found that in recent years, and also shown in the smart asset graph on the slide, the value of the dollar has gone up with an inflation rate of 2.15% from 2000 to 2020. The dollar value increasing in our country with a manageable rate of inflation like 2% allows consumers' incomes and assets to increase as well, or at least stabilize. And although we've faced an economic crisis in the last 20 years, the level of welfare has continued to improve in the country. Moreover, in situations in which GDP continues rising, and prices follow, there are inevitable issues that arise in the form of hyperinflation, in which a nation's currency loses almost all value and the country spirals into an economic disaster. At this point, consumers aren't even able to participate in the market because their currency isn't worth anything, impacting their income as well. An example of this could be shown in Venezuela's socioeconomic crisis and their currency instability, eventually causing their hyperinflation to rise to the point of 344,000% and completely hindering their economic growth. Overall, these findings have allowed me to conclude that inflation typically negatively impacts living standards, yet in recent years, consumer welfare has increased due to the 2% inflation rate, and the dollar value has increased as well with it. So, as I've discussed the negative implications of inflation on a nation's living standards, some may argue the neoclassical perspective that theorizes that the economy, regardless of inflation, should stabilize on its own. The perspective also argues that no social benefit exists when it comes to inflation, though my research has proven that production and subsequent increase in demand occurs within some points of inflation. Further, the neoclassical perspective does not believe in the Phillips curve at all, which, as I discussed before, creates a relationship between inflation rate and unemployment. The limitations to this then arise in the fact that these are only theories that aren't typically supported by data. This is, of course, important when considering how inflation and living standards are related and emphasizes the importance of the data. However, the limitations set in with discussing inflation rate the past 20 years because that research only shows the benefits of the 2% inflation rate rather than how it directly affects living standards. This research shows that there are benefits to some points of inflation. My answer could be discredited because my research in seeing how inflation rate and standard of living are related, and how that's really a negative relationship, how inflation rate negatively impacts living standards typically. There's a disconnect between that and inflation rate the past 20 years in our country, which has been beneficial and has emphasized welfare for a lot of consumers in our country. So that disconnect would discredit my answer.